I need you to forget everything you know about how economies work. Supply and demand, throw it out. Price signals, meaningless. Currency as a store of value, a joke. The basic assumptions that govern economic life everywhere else on Earth, they don't apply here. Welcome to Cuba, the island where nothing makes sense and everything somehow functions. A doctor earns $60 a month but can't afford cooking oil. A taxi driver with a 1957 Chevrolet makes more than a brain surgeon. The government reports 2% inflation while prices double in 6 months. There are three different currencies, and none of them work properly. The shelves are empty, but people eat. The hospitals have no medicine, but the system keeps running. The economy collapsed 30 years ago and never recovered, but 11 million people still live there, still work, still get married, still have children. How? How does a country survive when its economy has been clinically dead for decades? This is the story of the impossible economy, the most bizarre economic system on planet Earth, a masterclass in human adaptation to conditions that should not be survivable. This is how Cuba works, or doesn't work, or both at the same time. 1. The collapse that never ended. To understand Cuba today, you need to understand what happened in 1991. The Soviet Union dissolved, and with it, Cuba's entire economic model evaporated overnight. For 30 years, Cuba had survived as a Soviet client state. The arrangement was simple. Cuba exported sugar and provided a strategic foothold 90 miles from Florida. The Soviets provided everything else: oil, machinery, food, consumer goods. Subsidies worth approximately $5 billion annually. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Cuba lost 80% of its imports in a single year. 80%. Imagine your country suddenly losing 4/5 of everything it buys from abroad. GDP fell by 35%. Per capita caloric intake dropped from 2,900 to 1,800. Cubans lost an average of 20 pounds during what the government euphemistically called the special period in time of peace. Factories closed because there was no oil to run them. Farms couldn't harvest because there was no fuel for tractors. Public transportation stopped because there were no buses. This wasn't a recession. This was an economic near-death experience. And here's the thing. Cuba never recovered. The special period didn't end. It just became the new normal. 3 decades later, the economy remains in permanent crisis mode. Other countries hit by Soviet collapse, like Poland, Czechia, the Baltics, they reformed, integrated with the global economy, and grew. Cuba couldn't. The American embargo blocked that path. The government's ideological commitment blocked domestic reform. So, Cuba exists in suspended animation, a permanent emergency that has lasted a generation. 2. The three monies, a system designed to confuse. Let's talk about money. Or rather, monies. Plural. Until 2021, Cuba had 2 official currencies. The Cuban peso, called cup, was what workers were paid in. The convertible peso, called CUC, was pegged to the dollar and used for tourist transactions and imported goods. The exchange rate was 24 CUP to 1 CUC, but the government also maintained a fantasy rate of 1 CUP to 1 CUC for state accounting purposes. This created absurdities. A worker earned 400 CUP monthly, officially equivalent to 400 CUC at the government rate, but actually worth 17 CUC at the real rate. A jar of imported coffee cost 5 CUC, 1/3 of a month's real salary. A beer at a tourist hotel costs more than a doctor's daily wage. In 2021, the government unified the currencies, eliminating the CUC. This was supposed to simplify things. Instead, it created chaos. Inflation exploded. The government set the new exchange rate at 24 CUP to the dollar. The black market immediately went to 100, then 200, then 300 CUP to the dollar. Currently, it fluctuates around 300 or higher. So now Cuba has one official currency that nobody believes in, a black market rate that everyone uses, and the US dollar itself, which circulates illegally but is the only money that actually holds value. Prices are quoted in all three depending on context. A taxi ride might be 500 CUP or $2. A pound of pork might be 800 CUP or 3 MLC, a new digital currency backed by dollars that we'll get to later. The average Cuban navigates this monetary maze daily. They mentally convert between 3 different value systems, arbitrage between them when possible, and pray that whichever currency they're holding doesn't lose half its value by next week. 3. The ration book, socialism's last gift. Every Cuban family has a libreta, a ration book. This small booklet entitles them to a monthly allocation of basic goods at subsidized prices: rice, beans, sugar, cooking oil, eggs, sometimes chicken. The quantities are meager. The quality is poor, but the prices are almost free. The libreta was introduced in 1962 as a temporary measure during early shortages. 62 years later, it remains the backbone of Cuban survival. Here's how it works. Each household is registered at a specific bodega, a state-run store. Each month, they're entitled to specific quantities: 5 pounds of rice per person, half a pound of beans, a small amount of cooking oil. When the products arrive, and they don't always arrive, the bodega marks the libreta. The libreta supplies last about 2 weeks if you're careful. For the rest of the month, you're on your own. And on your own means the free market, where rice costs 20 times the subsidized price, where a pound of chicken represents a week's salary, where a bottle of cooking oil is a luxury item. The libreta creates a two-tier survival system: the baseline that keeps you from starving and the market that lets you actually live. Almost every Cuban needs both. This is the government's implicit social contract. We will give you just enough to survive in exchange for political compliance. It's not prosperity, it's managed scarcity. 4. The dollar dependency, the currency they hate but need. In 1993, at the depth of the special period, Fidel Castro did something ideologically unthinkable. He legalized the US dollar. For decades, the dollar had been the symbol of imperialism, illegal to possess. Suddenly, it was not only legal but essential. Cubans with access to dollars through family remittances or tourism work could buy goods that were impossible to obtain with pesos. This created an immediate social rupture. The professional class, doctors, engineers, teachers, earned worthless pesos. The emerging service class, taxi drivers, waiters, tour guides, earned dollar tips. A bellhop at a Havana hotel made more than the chief of surgery at a public hospital. The government tried to manage this by creating the CUC and requiring dollar conversion. In 2004, they banned the dollar again, but the dependency remained. Dollars flowed through remittances, estimated at over $3 billion annually before recent restrictions. Then, in 2019, the government created MLC, Moneda Libremente Convertible, a digital currency usable only in special state-run stores, backed theoretically by hard currency. To use MLC, you needed someone abroad to deposit dollars into your account. This was a formal surrender. The government created an entire parallel economy accessible only to people with access to foreign currency. If you had family in Miami, you could shop at well-stocked MLC stores. If you didn't, you stood in line at empty peso stores. Cuba now has economic apartheid based on dollar access. The haves and the have-nots are determined not by work or talent, but by whether your cousin made it to Florida. 5. The invented economy, GDP as fiction. What is Cuba's GDP? Officially, around $100 billion at government exchange rates. This would make Cuba a middle-income country, roughly comparable to Greece or Portugal on a per capita basis. This number is pure fiction. The government uses an exchange rate that doesn't reflect reality. It values state services at prices that bear no relationship to market rates. It counts production that doesn't happen and services that don't function. Economists who attempt to calculate real Cuban GDP using black market exchange rates and actual output estimate something closer to $30 or $40 billion. That would make Cuba one of the poorest countries in the hemisphere, comparable to Haiti on a per capita basis. The statistical manipulation isn't accidental, it's essential to the government's legitimacy. If Cubans knew their real GDP per capita was under $3,000, they might ask harder questions about 60 years of revolution. If international organizations reported Cuba as among the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere, the narrative of socialist success would collapse. So the numbers are massaged, output is invented, the economy exists partially in an imaginary realm where statistics say things that reality contradicts. Every Cuban knows this intuitively. They know that the statistics bear no relationship to their lived experience, but the fiction continues because the fiction is politically necessary. 6. The informal economy, how people actually survive. If the official economy is a fiction, how do Cubans actually survive? The answer is the informal economy, the black market, the hustle, what Cubans call resolver, to resolve. to figure it out, to make things work. Estimates suggest that 60% to 80% of real economic activity in Cuba happens informally. This isn't a bug in the system, it's the system. Let me describe a typical day of Cuban economic activity. A farmer grows vegetables on a small private plot. Legally, he should sell them to the state. Instead, he sells them directly to a middleman who pays more. The middleman has an illegal truck, which he runs on stolen gasoline. He sells the vegetables to a private restaurant, a paladar, which exists in a gray zone of semi-legality. The paladar buys black market vegetables with pesos but charges tourists in dollars or MLC. The owner converts some dollars to pesos at the black market rate, far better than the official rate. She uses the pesos to pay her cook, who uses them to buy black market chicken to feed his family. Every link in this chain is technically illegal or semi-legal, but without this chain, the food doesn't move, the restaurant doesn't operate, and people don't eat. The government knows this. The government tolerates this, because the alternative is collapse. Periodic crackdowns happen, usually when corruption becomes too visible or when someone needs to be made an example. But systematic enforcement is impossible. If the government actually shut down the black market, Cuba would starve within weeks. 7. The doctor who drives a taxi. Let me tell you about Dr. Rodriguez. He's a composite, but he's real. Dr. Rodriguez trained for 6 years at the University of Havana. He did his residency in internal medicine. He's a competent physician who would be valuable in any healthcare system in the world. His government salary is 5,000 Cuban pesos per month. At the black market rate, that's roughly $20. Dr. Rodriguez cannot feed his family on $20 a month. Nobody can, so he drives a taxi. He has an old car, inherited from his father. He bought a license to operate as a private taxi driver. He works at the hospital in the mornings, then drives tourists in the afternoons. A good day of driving earns him $30 in tips. 1 day of taxi work equals 6 weeks of doctor salary. So Dr. Rodriguez, trained at government expense to serve the healthcare system, spends half his time driving tourists from the airport to their hotels. This story repeats across the professional class. Engineers who rent rooms on Airbnb, professors who sell handicrafts to tourists, architects who work as bartenders. The government invested in creating human capital. The economy forces that human capital into survival activities. The waste is staggering. The country's most educated citizens spend their time figuring out how to get dollars rather than contributing their skills. 8. The remittance lifeline. 2 million Cubans live abroad, most of them in the United States. They send money home. Before recent restrictions, remittances totaled an estimated $3.5 billion annually. For context, that's more than Cuba earns from tourism, more than sugar exports, more than anything the domestic economy produces. Remittances aren't just money, they're survival. A typical arrangement. Maria in Miami sends $200 monthly to her mother in Havana. That $200, converted at black market rates, equals more than a year's professional salary. Maria's mother can buy food, medicine, and maintain her house. Without the remittance, she would be destitute. Multiply this by millions of families. The Cuban economy runs on money earned in Miami. The Trump administration tightened remittance restrictions in 2019 and 2020. The Biden administration eased some limits. The flow has been volatile, but the dependency remains. This creates a bizarre economic structure. Cuba's primary export is its people. Cubans leave, work abroad, and send money back. The domestic economy produces almost nothing of value. The remittance economy keeps everything afloat. The government officially criticizes the Miami exile community as traitors and worms. The government simultaneously depends on those exiles' money to prevent collapse. The contradiction is never acknowledged. 9. The tourism paradox. Cuba has beautiful beaches, colonial architecture, vintage cars, a romantic mystique of revolution and rum. Tourism should be an economic salvation. In some ways it is. In other ways, it's a trap. Before COVID, Cuba received over 4 million tourists annually. They stayed in state-run hotels, ate in state-run restaurants, drank state-produced rum. The government captured most of the revenue directly. But tourism created the dollar economy that divided Cuban society. It created incentives that pulled professionals into service work. It exposed Cubans to foreign goods and ideas that highlighted the failures of the domestic system. And tourism is volatile. When COVID hit, tourist arrivals dropped 90%. The economy, already struggling, went into freefall. The government solution was to build more hotels. During a pandemic, with the economy collapsing, Cuba continued constructing luxury resorts. The logic was that when tourism returned, the capacity would be there. The hotels are now open. Tourism has partially recovered. But the fundamental problem remains. Cuba is betting everything on an industry vulnerable to global shocks, American policy changes, and competition from neighbors with better infrastructure. The Caribbean is full of beaches. Cuba's only competitive advantage is the revolutionary mystique, the novelty of the forbidden island. That advantage depreciates. Each year, Cuba becomes less exotic and more just poor. 10. The system that won't die. So here's the question. Why hasn't the Cuban system collapsed? Other communist economies reformed or fell. The Soviet Union is gone. China became capitalist in everything but name. Vietnam opened up. Even North Korea maintains a massive military threat to justify its existence. Cuba just persists. Unreformed, unchanging, impossible. Part of the answer is the embargo. The American economic blockade, in place since 1962, provides an eternal excuse. Every shortage is blamed on the embargo. Every failure is imperialism's fault. The government has an external enemy that justifies permanent emergency measures. Part of the answer is geography. Cuba is an island. You can't walk across a border. Leaving requires boats, planes, and considerable risk. The exit valve that might create pressure for change is geographically restricted. Part of the answer is the libreta. That ration book provides just enough to prevent starvation. The population is kept at subsistence level, too poor to organize resistance, too dependent on state handouts to risk rebellion. Part of the answer is remittances. Money from Miami relieves pressure that might otherwise force change. The exile community, by supporting their families, inadvertently supports the system that created the exile. And part of the answer is adaptation. Cubans have learned to survive in conditions that would break other societies. The informal economy, the hustling, the resolver mentality, these are coping mechanisms that make the unbearable bearable. The system persists not because it works, but because it has made collapse marginally harder than continuation. 11. The coming crisis. But something is changing. The generation that remembers pre-revolutionary Cuba is dying. The generation that believed in revolutionary ideals is aging. The young Cubans coming of age now see only dysfunction. In July 2021, something unprecedented happened. Thousands of Cubans took to the streets in the largest protests since 1959. They chanted Libertad and down with the dictatorship. The government suppressed the protests with arrests and internet blackouts, but the fear barrier had been broken. The economy is in its worst state since the special period. Inflation is destroying savings. Blackouts last hours daily. Food is scarcer than it's been in decades. The COVID pandemic devastated tourism, and recovery is slow. Young Cubans are leaving in record numbers. Over 300,000 Cubans arrived at the US border in recent years. The exodus is draining the island of exactly the people needed for any future recovery: the young, the educated, the ambitious. The government's response has been minimal reform and maximum repression. Some small businesses have been legalized. Internet access has expanded. But the fundamental model remains unchanged. State control, political monopoly, managed scarcity. Nobody knows when or how the system might change. Perhaps it will persist for decades more. Perhaps a triggering event will cause rapid transformation. The one certainty is that the current model cannot improve lives. It can only continue survival. Conclusion: the economy that shouldn't exist. Cuba breaks every rule of economics. Price controls that should create shortages do create shortages, but people survive anyway. Wages that should be impossible to live on are impossible to live on, but people live anyway. A currency that should be worthless is worthless, but transactions happen anyway. The island functions on willpower, adaptation, family networks, and an informal economy larger than the formal one. It functions because humans are remarkably good at surviving when they have no other choice. This is neither a recommendation nor a condemnation. It's an observation. Cuba shows what happens when an economy is sustained by ideology rather than productivity, when statistics become propaganda, when the government's primary function is maintaining power rather than generating prosperity. The Cuban people deserve better. They are educated, creative, hardworking, and resilient. In a functional system, they would thrive. In the system they have, they survive. And survival, in Cuba, is its own kind of victory. When you see those beautiful photos of 1,950 seconds cars on the Malecon, remember, those cars are still running because Cubans had no choice but to keep them running. The vintage charm is actually desperate improvisation frozen in time. The impossible economy is possible only because the people trapped in it refuse to give up. If this glimpse into economic absurdity opened your eyes, hit that subscribe button, because the world is full of systems that don't make sense until you understand who benefits from the nonsense. See you in the comments. And remember, economics isn't just about money. Sometimes it's about surviving when the money itself has stopped making sense.